Long before the story of Atlantis, explorers and scientists spoke of Lemuria, a vanished land said to have bridged India, Africa, and Australia. They imagined a world of jungles and giants, of mountains that breathed fire, and skies lit by twin suns. Later came Mu, the supposed motherland of all civilizations, stretching across the Pacific, its temples shining like mirrors of the dawn. Both were said to have flourished before memory, both destroyed in a single age of fire and flood. This is the story of the worlds beneath the waves, where science and myth collide, and the line between history and imagination disappears. They once believed the map was finished, every river named, every coastline drawn. Humanity, it seemed, had nowhere left to hide its legends. Yet when the last corner of the earth was inked in, something strange happened. The imagination went deeper. It turned toward the sea. The 19th century was an age drunk on discovery. Railways, telegraphs, evolution itself. But it was also an age of loss. For every new law of nature uncovered, an older mystery vanished. The world had become explainable, measurable, and heartbreakingly complete. Still, a whisper remained, that beneath the calm surfaces of the Indian and Pacific Oceans lay something older than science could admit. That whisper began not with a prophet or a mystic, but with a man surrounded by specimen jars and stacks of notes. In 1864, Philip Lutley Sclater, an English zoologist of quiet manner and restless thought, noticed a riddle that refused to fit his charts. The lemur, a small, wide-eyed creature of Madagascar, had cousins scattered across the Indian Ocean, yet none in Africa or Arabia. Nature, usually so methodical, had left her footprints in impossible places. In a few spare pages of a paper titled The Mammals of Madagascar, Sclater proposed something audacious. Once, long ago, there had been a land bridge connecting Madagascar, India, and the distant islands beyond. A continent now lost beneath the waves. He called it Lemuria, not out of poetry, but practicality, a name drawn from the animal that had betrayed its existence. It should have been nothing more than a footnote in zoology, but the 19th century was a world trembling between revelation and ruin. Darwin had just cracked open creation. The earth had suddenly become ancient, unknowable, vast beyond faith. The Victorians wanted order, but they also wanted wonder. Lemuria offered both, a bridge between the scientific and the sublime. Soon, the idea escaped its author's intent. Ernst Haeckel, a German naturalist and one of Darwin's fiercest evangelists, saw in Lemuria not a zoological curiosity, but a cradle of life itself. In his History of Creation, 1868, he wrote of a now sunken land beneath the Indian Ocean, which might well have been the cradle of the earliest men. The phrase was enough. Overnight, Lemuria ceased to be a theory. It became a birthplace. Haeckel imagined a continent lush and glowing, stretching from East Africa to the Malay archipelago, a realm where the first beings, neither ape nor man, took form. It was a seductive picture, the dawn of humanity, rising not in the dry African savanna, but in a tropical paradise now drowned by time. Science had given myth a new Eden, but not everyone was convinced. Alfred Russel Wallace, Darwin's cautious counterpart, read the same data and refused to follow. He argued that oceans did not simply vanish, that the Earth's crust did not collapse like a stage trapdoor. For Wallace, species migrated, they did not drown. His rebuttal was correct, prophetic even, but in an age hungry for mystery, truth made little noise. While the scientific world argued, Lemuria began to drift. It slipped quietly out of academia, and into imagination. Popular journals printed maps of the lost land. Novels and parlor lectures turned it into a stage for vanished peoples and ancient gods. To an empire obsessed with exploration, the idea of another world, one beneath the sea, was irresistible. And still, the theory clung to a sliver of plausibility. The Indian Ocean floor was then a blank space, its depths uncharted. Great volcanic scars like the Deccan Traps hinted at upheavals vast enough to swallow continents. Fossil trails suggested kinships across impossible distances. If the Earth could change so violently, who could swear that whole worlds had not slipped beneath its waves? In the closing years of the century, as geology matured, Lemuria began to falter under the weight of real evidence. The discovery of Gondwana, the ancient supercontinent, revealed that the continents had once been joined, but in ways far older and stranger than Sclater could have guessed. Lemuria, it turned out, was not missing. It had never existed at all. But facts could not kill what wonder had already claimed. For now, Lemuria was more than a scientific theory. It was a mirror for the century's restlessness. It answered the unease of a world that had measured everything and still felt incomplete. If heaven had moved from the skies to the stars, perhaps Eden had merely sunk beneath the sea. Within a few decades, the lost land would take on a new life, no longer drawn in zoological charts, but in sacred diagrams and clairvoyant maps. Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophists would speak of Lemuria not as a bridge of land, but as a bridge of spirit, the birthplace of the first souls, a world before the fall into flesh. The scientists' speculation would become scripture. For now, the name remains freshly inked, hovering between reason and revelation. Lemuria, a word made from an animal, transformed into an age. It began as the answer to a question about lemurs, and ended as the promise of something larger, that perhaps the past was deeper than memory, and the sea hid not extinction but beginnings. Legends told of a world before Atlantis, a cradle of humankind rising from oceans that had only just learned to breathe. By the end of the 19th century, the lost land had already escaped the hands of science. What began as a zoological puzzle had become a stage for the imagination. Lemuria was no longer a bridge of stone. It was a bridge between worlds, between evolution and creation, between the known and the eternal. In that restless age of discovery, when telescopes reached farther than faith and Darwin had redrawn the story of life, there was still a hunger for origins that science could not fill. Lemuria offered an answer that felt ancient and comforting. The idea that before the known civilizations, before Egypt, before Sumer, there had been another dawn. The vision was intoxicating. Lemuria was described as a vast tropical realm, stretching from Madagascar to the islands of the Pacific. Its shores were lined with smoking volcanoes, its jungles heavy with heat and thunder. This was no Eden of still air and perfect order, but a living, volatile world, a planet in motion. The air shimmered with mist. The ground steamed with creation. It was said that this was where the first beings awakened, tall, luminous creatures still half spirit, not yet bound by the weight of flesh. They lived in harmony with the earth, guided by instinct and dream, unaware of time or death. For an age, existence was effortless. The world itself supplied every need, and thought was its own language. But awakening has its cost. When these early beings became self-aware, they also became separate. Desire, curiosity, love, all were born together. The moment they learned to name the world, they also learned to fear losing it. It was, as the mystics wrote, the first fall, not from grace, but into consciousness. The story spread quickly through the circles of the theosophical movement, a blend of philosophy, mysticism, and Eastern symbolism that captivated the late Victorian imagination. Lemuria became their missing epoch, the bridge between divine creation and human history. They spoke of root races, each a stage of spiritual evolution, and placed Lemuria as the home of the third, beings whose souls first learned the weight of matter. Writers and seekers reimagined the land in exquisite detail. They drew maps of its long mountain chains, its vast interior plains, and the gleaming shores where the first temples stood. Lemuria, they said, had been the world's first civilization, not one of tools and cities, but of consciousness. Its people understood the rhythm of the planet, the power of sound and color, the harmony between nature and will. For a public weary of factories and smoke, this was irresistible. Theosophy offered a cosmology that felt both ancient and modern, an evolution of the spirit rather than the body. It promised that humanity had not descended from chaos, but from light. And yet, even as the details grew elaborate, the timelines, the maps, the catalogues of vanished races, Lemuria remained something larger than any creed. It was the symbol of a first beginning, a vision of what humankind might once have been, before history hardened the world. It answered not the question of where we came from, but of what we lost. The myth's geography reached far beyond the Indian Ocean. Some said its remnants still surfaced in the Pacific, others in the high plateaus of India or the islands of Indonesia. Volcanoes, they believed, marked the broken heart of the old continent, its fire still breathing beneath the sea. And in these stories, echoes of other traditions began to stir, of Nagas and serpent peoples, of the Dravidian southlands, of islands swallowed by storms. For a moment, Lemuria stood at the meeting point of all mysteries. It was scientific theory, reshaped into sacred memory, a lost world reborn as metaphor. Beneath its surface, people saw everything the modern age had forgotten: unity, purpose, belonging. Before long, a new name would rise from across the Pacific, another sunken empire, said to have ruled the world when Lemuria was still young. Its chroniclers called it Mu. And just as Lemuria had transformed science into myth, Mu would transform myth into revelation. By the early 20th century, the world had changed again. The empires of Europe ruled the map, their explorers charting every horizon, their scholars unearthing the bones of prehistory. The seas were no longer unknown, but the human mind still was. Somewhere between archaeology and revelation, a new story rose from the Pacific. Another lost world, another beginning. Its name was Mu. The man who gave it shape was a retired British officer, James Churchward, whose life seemed made for colonial legend. He had served in India, studied local languages, and claimed to have gained access to a trove of sacred knowledge hidden from the Western world. Among those secrets, he said, were ancient tablets written in an unknown script, the Nakal records, chronicling a civilization that had once spanned the entire Pacific Ocean. Churchward spoke of them as fact, not faith. He insisted he had studied the tablets under the guidance of Indian priests who guarded them as relics of a forgotten world. From these, he said, came the story of Mu, a continent so vast that it stretched from Hawaii to Easter Island, a land of radiant cities and golden temples that had ruled the world when Europe was still sea and dust. In 1926, he published The Lost Continent of Mu, a work that mixed earnest conviction with a storyteller's flourish. Its tone was half archaeological, half prophetic. All the modern races of man, he wrote, are the children of Mu. This single line would ignite a century of fascination. According to him, Mu was the motherland of civilization, a place of gentle climate and perfect balance, where 10 great tribes lived under one rule and one faith. At its center stood the city of the sun, ruled by a priest-king named Ramu, whose name carried the echo of Egypt's later god. The people of Mu, he said, were highly advanced in architecture, agriculture, and spiritual science. They harnessed cosmic energy through vast crystals, used sound to move matter, and communicated across distances through thought. It was an empire of light, harmonious, virtuous, impossibly ideal. Its religion centered on the divine creative force, symbolized by the sun and the cross, which Churchwood presented as the true source of every later faith. The temples of Egypt, the glyphs of the Maya, the spirals of Polynesia, all, he claimed, were fragments of Mu's lost theology. At its height, Churchwood said, Mu was home to 64 million people. Its 10 kingdoms flourished across fertile plains, connected by canals and causeways. Its artisans created languages of sacred geometry. Its philosophers studied the soul as a science. But even a paradise can fall. He described the end of Mu with the drama of revelation, a chain of volcanic cataclysms that tore open the ocean floor, plunging entire cities beneath the sea. The land trembled and shook like the leaves of a tree in a storm, he wrote. Then came darkness, lightning, and fire. The waters rose and covered the face of the earth. In a single night, the mother continent disappeared, leaving only its island peaks, Hawaii, Fiji, Tahiti, and Easter Island, as silent witnesses. From its survivors, he said, came all the world's ancient civilizations. They fled east to the Americas, west to Asia and Africa, carrying fragments of Mu's wisdom in myths and symbols, the sun worship of Egypt, the feathered serpents of Central America, the megaliths of Polynesia. Each, to Churchwood, was a clue, a message left by exiles from the drowned world. The theory arrived at the perfect time. The First World War had shattered faith in progress. The Industrial Age had dimmed the old optimism of empire. People longed for a story of innocence lost, a world before greed and steel. Mu became that world, pure, wise, and tragically doomed. Churchwood's books, The Children of Mu, the sacred symbols of Mu, the cosmic forces of Mu, poured out through the 1930s. They were written in the confident voice of a man explaining, not imagining. He filled his pages with maps, diagrams, and photographs of carvings from Mexico to Burma, insisting they were all remnants of the same civilization. Critics dismissed it as fantasy, but readers devoured it. The idea that all cultures shared a single prehistoric origin was too seductive to ignore. To modern scholars, Churchwood's Mu was a fiction stitched together from colonial encounters and misread archaeology. But to his audience, it offered a unifying myth, one that made the scattered fragments of the ancient world cohere. He wasn't just describing a continent, he was offering a theory of humanity. Where Lemuria had appealed to the mystics of Europe, Mu belonged to a different kind of dreamer, the explorer, the amateur scholar, the believer that truth could still be buried somewhere just beyond the map. The Pacific, vast and unmapped in its depths, was the perfect stage. Unlike the Mediterranean, heavy with ruins, or the Indian Ocean, thick with trade, the Pacific seemed eternal, untouched, a blank slate on which to write the memory of paradise. Mu also fit the mood of its century, the idea of a perfect civilization undone by its own excess, the warning of nature reclaiming what man had forgotten to revere. Churchwood claimed that Mu's fall was not divine punishment, but natural law, an imbalance between spiritual and physical forces, a civilization that had forgotten its harmony with the earth. In that sense, his lost world was less a fantasy than a parable for modernity. As decades passed, the legend of Mu began to intertwine with the other great myth of the age, Lemuria. Writers blurred their boundaries. Mystics merged their timelines. Some said Mu was the eastern half of the same vanished land. Others that it was Lemuria's descendant or mirror. Together, they formed a mythic map stretching from Madagascar to Polynesia, from memory into dream. The two continents had been born from science, reshaped by belief and carried forward by imagination. Each was a reflection of the other, one born in the Indian Ocean, the other in the Pacific, both born of the same hunger, the desire to believe that humanity began not in chaos, but in light. For a time, the Pacific became the new cradle of all lost things. Explorers combed its islands for ruins that matched Churchward's visions. Scholars found nothing but beauty, but the absence of proof only deepened the allure. A story that cannot be disproven becomes harder to forget. By the middle of the century, the world had turned its attention to the stars. The old mysteries sank again, but not entirely. The idea of Mu and of Lemuria before it would survive in new forms, reborn in occult circles, pulp novels, and whispers of secret knowledge waiting beneath the waves. For now, the Pacific sleeps, its floor mapped by satellites, its ridges traced by submersibles. Yet every so often, a tremor passes through myth, a memory rising from the deep. When it does, the image returns, a radiant continent beneath the morning sun, ruled by wisdom, consumed by fire, and remembered only by the sea. By the end of the 19th century, the myth of Lemuria had grown too powerful to remain geological. It was no longer a continent to be measured, but a memory to be interpreted. Within the circles of theosophy, it found its most elaborate form. Not a land lost to the sea, but an epoch in the evolution of spirit. If Darwin traced the origin of bodies, theosophy would trace the origin of souls. The idea was simple and monumental. Humanity had not appeared all at once, but in stages, root races, each marking a step in the slow descent of spirit into matter. The Lemurians, according to this doctrine, were the third root race, the ancestors of all who came after, the first beings to awaken consciousness within flesh. Before them had been two others, one too ethereal to leave a trace, the next luminous but incomplete. Lemuria was where awareness took its first human form. In these writings, the continent became almost a character, a world still raw with fire, vast and unstable, stretching across the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Volcanoes marked its horizon. The air shimmered with heat. Life pulsed everywhere. Forests the size of nations. Seas teeming with creatures long vanished from the fossil record. The earth itself, they said, was still young. Not in years, but in soul. Here, among its molten hills and emerald valleys, the Lemurians appeared. They were not yet human in the way we understand it. Theosophical accounts described them as towering figures, 15 feet tall or more, with dark, radiant skin and features still fluid, as if half-formed by creation. Their eyes glowed faintly. Some were said to possess a third eye, a vestige of an ancient organ of perception, not for seeing outward, but inward into the fabric of existence. They lived without fear, for death was unknown to them. They were born not of mothers, but of the earth itself, hatched from translucent eggs of energy and substance, the egg-born. For ages, they multiplied without desire or division, and the world seemed whole. But harmony, once achieved, never holds forever. As the Lemurians grew more aware, their form began to change. Some became hermaphroditic, containing both aspects of creation within them. Others began to divide into two distinct sexes. This was the first great transformation, the moment when unity gave way to duality, when love and longing entered the story of humankind. To theosophists, it was both blessing and fall, the dawn of individuality and the loss of innocence in one breath. With the awakening of desire came the awakening of knowledge. The Lemurians began to shape their world consciously. They discovered fire, not as a tool, but as a sacred element, a bridge between matter and spirit. They built dwellings from volcanic glass, raised colossal stones in geometric alignment with the stars. The land itself was their temple, and every mountain was a symbol of ascent. Yet within this new power lurked danger. Theosophical texts spoke of a division between the sons of light and the sons of the shadow, those who preserved the harmony of creation and those who sought dominion over it. The first worked with the energies of nature. The second tried to command them. It was said that the misuse of these forces brought ruin upon the land, that Lemuria trembled not only under the weight of volcanoes, but under the imbalance of will. Into this world came the Kumaras, beings of higher origin, divine instructors, descending, as the text said, from the planet Venus. They taught the Lemurians the laws of balance, of harmony between inner and outer worlds. Under their guidance, civilization flowered. The Lemurians learned to read the movement of stars, to understand sound as structure, and to use vibration as a form of energy. To later mystics, this was the first true golden age, an epoch of harmony between heaven and earth. But the same stories warn that knowledge, once given, cannot be contained. Over time, pride grew among the people. Some sought mastery over their own creators, wielding the elemental forces that sustained their world. Others turned to darker uses, experiments of power that, in later ages, would be remembered as sorcery. The balance began to tilt again. In the theosophical vision, Lemuria's history was not measured in years, but in turning points. The separation of the sexes, the discovery of fire, the corruption of sacred power. Each event marked a descent, the spirit growing heavier, more bound to the world it had once only dreamed. The earth answered with signs, storms, earthquakes, slow sinkings of coastlines into the sea. The fall of Lemuria was not a single catastrophe, but a series of withdrawals, the sea reclaiming what the land could no longer hold. As fire broke from the mountains, islands vanished. The survivors fled to the highlands, carrying what knowledge they could preserve. In theosophical cosmology, this was not an extinction, but a migration of the soul. The Lemurians became the seed of future races, the ancestors of Atlantis, and through them, of us. To the modern reader, such accounts may sound like allegory, but to their authors they were history, written in another kind of language. Theosophy was never about proof. It was about pattern, the search for continuity in an age that had replaced faith with data. If Darwin described evolution as the survival of forms, Theosophy described it as the evolution of meaning. Lemuria's story was not about geology or anthropology, but the inner unfolding of consciousness. It was a myth of progress in reverse, not ascent from beasts, but descent from gods. Humanity, in this telling, was not born ignorant and rising toward wisdom, but born wise and falling toward forgetfulness. Each age drifted further from the original light, and each rediscovery of truth was a faint remembrance of what had once been. Even so, There was dignity in the fall. The Lemurians, said the mystics, were the first to bear the burden of awareness, the first to feel both wonder and guilt, both creation and loss. They were the bridge between the elemental and the human, between dream and history. Their story lingered because it captured something essential about us, that consciousness is both a gift and a wound, that to awaken is also to grieve. When theosophical writers spoke of Lemuria's end, they did not describe defeat, but transformation. The continent sank, they said, so that a new world could rise, Atlantis, the next cycle of spirit in matter. The Lemurians did not vanish. They became memory itself, folded into every myth of a paradise lost. The oceans may have swallowed the land, but not the idea. Even now, the name carries the weight of origins, the dream of a time when humanity was still whole, when the world itself seemed young enough to speak back, and far beyond the ruins of Lemuria, across the great Pacific, another story waited to join it, of a sister continent, a second paradise, where the descendants of the first age would build temples of light before the waters claimed them too. If Lemuria began as the world's first morning, its end was a long twilight, centuries of brilliance giving way to dissonance. In the theosophical imagination, this was not the sudden drowning of a continent, but the slow unraveling of harmony. The people of Lemuria had reached a height unknown before them, yet with awareness came division. The unity that had once defined their age began to fracture from within. They were no longer the translucent beings of mythic dawn, but creatures of flesh and will. Their eyes no longer saw through time. Their hearts had learned the ache of possession. The same mind that had once called fire from stone now turned that fire against itself. The Lemurians had learned mastery, but not restraint. Among their legends survives the tale of two paths, the Lords of the Light and the Lords of the Dark Face. One sought to preserve the harmony between spirit and matter. The other hungered to control the hidden forces of creation. The light built temples that resonated with the planet's rhythm, healing the land through sound and vibration. The dark experimented with energies that warped the air, commanding the elements instead of serving them. Both believed themselves righteous, and in their rivalry, the continent trembled. It was said that the first stone cities were raised during this time. Colossal fortresses carved from obsidian and basalt, aligned with the stars. The Lemurians had begun to settle permanently, abandoning the nomadic life of the early races. They mined the earth, harvested its crystals, and learned the geometry of power. Knowledge, once fluid and intuitive, became guarded, inherited, and misused. From the temples of the interior rose priesthoods who claimed descent from the Kumaras, those celestial instructors who had once walked among them. Their teachings spoke of balance and moderation, but ambition had already taken root. Volcanoes flared across the equator. The land itself seemed restless. Some texts later called this the world's first war, not of armies, but of forces unseen. The war of the sun and shadow, as it came to be known in esoteric retellings, was fought not with weapons, but with will. Those who aligned with the creative fire against those who bent it for dominion. It ended, if such a war can end, with exhaustion. The seas claiming their share of coastlines. The skies darkening with ash. In these myths, the world of Lemuria had begun to crack, both literally and spiritually. Great rifts opened across the continent. Storms tore through its jungles. The once luminous skies dimmed. Some believed these cataclysms were punishment, the earth reclaiming the balance its children had disturbed. Others said it was the natural cycle of worlds, the shedding of an age so another could begin. Amid ruin, fragments of its people fled. The highlands became sanctuaries, sacred plateaus where the remaining priest-kings preserved their records and rites. The theosophists claimed that some migrated north and west, reaching the coasts of India and Africa. Others followed the rising Pacific currents toward the Americas. Wherever they went, they carried the memory of their lost homeland. The sun's symbol, the serpent, the spiral, all echoes of a science that had once united heaven and earth. Even in decline, the Lemurians were said to achieve wonders. Their last cities, the crystal metropolises, described in later writings, combined architecture and energy in forms modern eyes can scarcely imagine. Towers of translucent stone hummed with planetary frequency. Entire structures glowed at night, powered by fields of light drawn from the earth itself. But brilliance turned inward becomes peril. In their final generations, the chroniclers wrote, Lemurian mastery hardened into ritual and hierarchy. Knowledge became ceremony. Worship became control. Among the faithful, there were still those who remembered the ancient harmony. They withdrew to the mountains, refusing to join the quarrels of the great city-states. Some found refuge in caverns said to lie beneath the volcanic ranges, passages that would, in later centuries, give rise to legends of hidden realms. One tale spoke of a sacred refuge that endured even after the waves came, a subterranean sanctuary beneath a snow-covered peak on the western edge of the world. Long after the continent vanished, that mountain would bear the name Shasta, and stories would claim that the last Lemurians still lived beneath it, guarding the wisdom of their age. The legends multiplied. Other exiles, it was said, sailed east, carried by storms to the shores of Peru and Bolivia, where they built the first stone terraces at Tiahuanaco. Some reached southern India, giving rise to the ancient Dravidian cultures. Others vanished into the islands that dot the Pacific, their descendants remembered as gods who came from the sea. The myth of the wanderers became humanity's first diaspora, not of peoples, but of memory itself. As the centuries of fire lengthened, the earth's crust heaved again. Mountains rose where forests had stood. Entire valleys sank beneath boiling seas. The continent that had once seemed eternal began to vanish piece by piece. The survivors watched their world contract. Vast plains turned to archipelagos, inland lakes to gulfs, cities to islands. Each tremor was a lesson, each sinking a warning. The Lemurians who had once shaped the elements now understood what it meant to be at their mercy. For the theosophists, this was not merely the story of a lost civilization, but of human nature itself, the moment when creation began to outgrow its innocence. Lemuria's fall was not a punishment from above, but a consequence of imbalance, the inevitable shadow of progress without wisdom. The division between the light and the dark was not just their story, it was ours. What followed was silence, the kind that stretches over ages. The sea reclaimed its dominion, and the last peaks of Lemuria slipped beneath the horizon. All that remained were memories carried by its scattered children, fragments of language and symbol that would surface again in the myths of far-off lands. The age of fire was over. The age of water had begun. And yet, from that destruction came the seed of the next world. Theosophical writings claim that the Lemurian spirit did not die but transformed, giving birth to the next root race, the Atlanteans, who would inherit both the glories and the errors of their forebears. The earth, in this telling, is not cruel but cyclical. What drowns one civilization prepares the ground for another. Modern geology would one day offer its own explanation. The slow drift of continents, the restless plates of the earth, reshaping themselves over millions of years. But even the most precise science could not erase the resonance of the story. Lemuria endures because it speaks a language older than fact. The human need to understand our power and our peril as one. And so, the myth of the Splintering remains. A civilization that reached too far into the heart of creation and was undone by its own brilliance. From its ashes rose the next dream, carried by the survivors across the ocean's dark mirror. The world would remember them by many names: builders, watchers, wanderers. But in every legend, the same refrain. They came from the land that sank beneath the sun. Across the ocean from the smouldering memory of Lemuria, another story was gathering shape. The Pacific, vast and unbroken, had long been imagined as a mirror of the sky, its scattered islands the peaks of a drowned world. For James Churchward, it was more than metaphor. He believed those islands were the last surviving summits of Mu, the motherland of humankind, a continent once radiant with order and peace. To him, Mu was no myth. It was a civilization lost to the ocean, but not to history. He wrote of it as one might describe an empire recently fallen, its cities mapped, its laws preserved in the Narkal tablets he claimed to have seen in India. Whether those tablets existed or not mattered little. What drew his readers was the grandeur of the world they described. Churchward's Mu was a paradise of reason and reverence. Its people lived under a single faith, guided by the understanding that the universe was one great field of energy, what he called the divine creative force. They did not pray to it, they participated in it. Life itself, he said, was an act of worship. The cross within the circle, later symbols in Egypt and among the Maya, was, in his telling, the emblem of Mu's sacred law, spirit and matter, bound in balance. The empire was said to be divided into 10 great tribes, united under the priest-king Ra-Mu, he who rules by the light of the sun. From his temple in the central city, he governed not through armies, but through knowledge. Each of the 10 kingdoms maintained its own schools, observatories, and temples of learning. The Narkal priesthood, men and women trained from birth in astronomy, medicine, and the sciences of sound and color, formed the empire's living memory. In the valleys, terraces glittered with irrigation channels that shimmered like veins of silver. Farmers cultivated fruits and grains unknown to later ages. Artisans shaped metal with precision that Churchward insisted could only come from lost technology. Above them rose towers of polished stone capped with crystal domes, reflecting the light of the morning sun. It was a city that glowed. But what set Mu apart was not its beauty, but its harmony. There was no poverty, no crime, Churchward wrote. Every man knew the law, and the law was truth. The people of Mu did not see the world as separate from themselves. Their science was their religion, their art a continuation of nature's design. They studied vibration and energy, not as abstractions, but as forces that could heal the body and the land. They built what he called temples of resonance, places where sound could purify and align the spirit. Later writers would embellish this vision. Airships powered by crystalline energy, devices that could draw force from the magnetic field of the earth, luminous roads that carried travelers by vibration rather than motion. These were the inventions of faith as much as imagination, symbols of a lost unity between technology and soul. For Churchward, Mu's wisdom did not die with its continent. He saw its remnants in every ancient culture: the pyramid builders of Egypt, the astronomers of Central America, the navigators of Polynesia. All, he claimed, were colonies of the motherland. the spiral, the serpent, the rising sun. The same motifs echoed from the Andes to Angkor. Each was a page torn from the same cosmic book. His theories blurred boundaries between myth and history, but their appeal was undeniable. The notion that humanity shared a single, luminous origin, that race and nation were late divisions of one family, spoke to a century desperate for unity after the ruins of war. Mu was a myth of connection in an age of fracture. Yet in Churchward's telling, even perfection carried the seed of its own undoing. The priests of Mu, he wrote, warned of imbalance. The world's energy must remain in harmony, or destruction would follow. For centuries, that warning went unheeded. Then the signs began. Trembling earth, blood-red sunsets, seas that refused the tide. The empire's greatest minds searched for cause, but the fault lay deeper than reason could reach. The final cataclysm came without mercy. Churchward described it as if from memory. The sky darkened, lightning split the horizon, and the continent tore open. Gas belts, he claimed, exploded beneath the ocean floor. Fire consumed the cities. Waves higher than mountains devoured the land. In a single night, 64 million souls vanished, leaving only fragments of islands to mark their passing. For a generation raised on progress and machines, such imagery was both terrifying and beautiful. The end of Mu read like prophecy, an empire undone not by barbarism, but by imbalance, a lesson written in the language of disaster. If Lemuria had fallen through pride, Mu had fallen through knowledge without humility. Modern geologists dismissed it all. The Pacific floor, they said, had never held a continent, only scattered volcanic chains. But Churchward's Mu was never really about geography. It was a parable of equilibrium, a world that had achieved peace because it understood the invisible thread connecting all life, and a warning that the thread could be broken. Even as his book slipped out of print, the image endured, a golden empire beneath the waves, its priests watching the horizon for the tremor that would end their age. Artists painted it, occultists preached it, travelers looked for its traces on far-flung islands. Mu had become not a place, but an idea, the possibility that somewhere, once, humanity had lived in balance with the world. In the decades that followed, fragments of that idea would reappear in unexpected places. In spiritualist circles, in New Age teachings, in stories of hidden civilizations that still guided humankind from the depths of the sea or the peaks of sacred mountains. The Empire of Light would never be entirely forgotten. And as its memory intertwined with that of Lemuria, the two stories began to form a single arc. Twin continents, twin experiments, each destroyed by its own awakening. Together they became a myth of beginnings and endings, a mirror for every age that dreamed of perfection and feared the cost of it. The Pacific, calm on the surface, still hides its ridges and trenches, its islands of basalt rising like the bones of an older world. Churchward's maps have faded, but his question remains. If humanity once knew balance, can it ever remember it again? No continent dies in silence. The stories of Lemuria and Mu end not with disappearance, but with upheaval. The sky burning, the sea rising, the earth itself revolting against its own creation. Whether described in the language of geology or myth, both worlds were said to perish in fire and water, undone by the same forces that had once birthed them. By the time these tales took their full shape in the early 20th century, the idea of cataclysm had become the heartbeat of every lost civilization myth. Theosophical texts spoke of Lemuria's destruction 75,000 years ago. Churchward placed the fall of Mu around 12,000 BC. Edgar Casey, the sleeping prophet of Virginia Beach, claimed in trance readings that both lands had met their ends through the misuse of elemental energy, fire harnessed without wisdom. The dates and details varied, but the rhythm was the same: creation, hubris, collapse. The age of balance gave way to an age of tremors. Lemuria, it was said, began to shatter first. Theosophical accounts describe fire bursting from its mountains, black smoke veiling the sun, and a red rain falling on its forests. Great rifts opened across the equator, lakes drained into the abyss, entire cities slid into fire-lit chasms. Those who survived fled to the remaining highlands, watching their homeland fracture into islands. The sea, patient for ages, had begun to reclaim what was hers. In the Pacific, the chronicles of Mu followed a similar pattern. Churchward described gas belts deep beneath the ocean floor, vast chambers of pressure that one day erupted like the lungs of the world. The land convulsed, split apart, and folded into itself. He wrote with the precision of an eyewitness. The fires of the underneath burst forth. The land trembled and shook like the leaves of a tree. In a storm, flames engulfed the horizon. Then came the sound, a roar so vast that even the gods, he said, fell silent. The cataclysm was total. Cities sank beneath walls of water. Mountains broke into smoke. The air turned to ash. In Churchward's telling, 64 million people perished in a single night. Their temples cracked, their lights extinguished, and the ocean floor swallowed their fields. When the storm ended, nothing remained but a scattered necklace of islands, the faint outline of a civilization erased by the deep. To modern ears, these are apocalyptic dreams, but they carried the weight of scientific curiosity. The late 19th century was an age fascinated by disaster. Volcanoes like Krakatoa had already shown the world how quickly paradise could turn to ruin. Flood myths resurfaced everywhere, in Sumer, in Polynesia, in the Book of Genesis, each whispering that water remembers. For the writers who inherited Sclater's Lemuria and Churchward's Mu, such parallels were proof that humanity's oldest memory was of a world destroyed. The Theosophists turned the destruction into allegory. Lemuria's end was not mere geology. It was the moral pivot of history, the punishment for imbalance between spirit and matter. When the lords of the dark face harnessed forces they did not understand, they drew fire from the earth's heart, unleashing what they believed they could control. The mountains answered with fury. The destruction of Lemuria was thus both external and internal, the planet cleansing itself and consciousness beginning again in a new form. Churchward, by contrast, cast Mu's demise as tragedy without malice. His empire had not fallen to sin, but to nature's rhythm. The motherland sank, he wrote, because the breath of the earth shifted. There was no judgment, only inevitability. Civilizations, like continents, had lifespans. Mu had reached the height of harmony, and so its decline was only balance restored. Even so, both tales dwell on survivors, the remnant who refused extinction. The priests of Lemuria, forewarned by signs in the stars, were said to have fled eastward, carrying tablets and sacred objects to the rising lands of Asia and Africa. The Narkal priests of Mu, reading the same omens, gathered their disciples and set sail before the final convulsion. In Churchward's account, they became the seed-bearers of the next age, founding colonies that would one day become Egypt, Sumer, and the Maya world. Modern geology would later map its own cataclysms. The Toba supervolcano of roughly 74,000 years ago, which veiled the planet in ash and nearly erased early humanity. The flooding of coastal lands at the end of the Ice Age, 12 millennia ago, when glaciers melted and seas rose nearly 400 feet. The science was real, the timing coincidental, but the echoes were irresistible. Every culture carried its own version of the same story, the world remade in fire and flood. The myths also reflected the anxieties of the modern world. As earthquakes rattled cities and steamships sank beneath the ocean, the 19th and 20th centuries found their own metaphors for fragility. The fall of Lemuria and Mu became parables for empires on the brink, lessons in hubris, in the limits of knowledge, in the cost of forgetting balance. Each retelling mirrored the fears of its age: the industrial world's conquest of nature, the scientific world's loss of wonder. In theosophical circles, the destruction of Lemuria marked not an ending, but a transference. The fourth root race, the Atlanteans, would inherit the remnants of the old wisdom. They would build cities of crystal and air, mastering forces that once belonged to the gods, only to repeat the cycle of pride and fall. Lemuria was the prototype, Atlantis its mirror. Together they formed the great pattern of human history: rise, mastery, imbalance, renewal. The storytellers described the final hours of Lemuria with quiet awe. The horizon bled red. The earth groaned beneath its own weight. The oceans advanced mile by mile. From mountain peaks, the survivors watched their valleys drown. Lightning illuminated the ruins of their temples, and thunder carried the sound of the continent's last heartbeat. In the stillness that followed, only the sea remained, vast and new, as if the planet had drawn breath again. For the myth-makers, that silence was not emptiness. It was remembrance. Beneath the waves, they said, the knowledge of the old world slept, waiting for an age ready to recall it. Some claimed that even now, deep beneath the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, ancient libraries lie entombed in crystal vaults, their symbols intact, their lessons unforgotten. Whether taken as history, allegory, or dream, the story endures because it satisfies something elemental. We are a species haunted by both creation and loss. Every dawn invites a memory of what was destroyed to make it possible. Lemuria and Mu remind us that the earth itself has always been our mirror, unstable, magnificent, and alive. When the oceans finally closed over the last fragments of land, the world that followed was new. The survivors wandered, carrying fragments of their faith into mountains and deserts. From their scattered seeds, the myths of the next age would grow. Stories of serpents, suns, and drowned kingdoms that would one day be called Atlantis. And as the waves settled, so did the silence. The continents might shift again, but the pattern was already written. What rises will sink, what sinks will return, and what humanity forgets will forever find its way back through story. When the fire and the water had finished their work, silence ruled the world. The continents were gone, and the sun rose over empty seas. Yet in every telling, a remnant endured. A handful of souls who escaped the ruin and carried its memory across the new earth. The world that followed did not begin from nothing. It began from survivors. The stories disagree on who they were. Some call them the last Lemurians, others the exiles of Mu, but all describe them as bearers of knowledge, the custodians of a vanished age. They left the peaks of their dying homeland in ships of light or stone or cedar, sailing toward the horizons that still stood above the waves. In theosophical writings, these voyages were the bridge between worlds, the link between the third root race of Lemuria and the coming fourth, the Atlanteans. From these survivors, it was said, came the first seeds of civilization. They landed on the highlands of Asia, where the air was thin and the stars close. They reached the mountains of India and Tibet, where they carved the first symbols of fire and serpent upon the stone. They crossed island chains that no longer exist, through Indonesia, through the South Pacific, through Polynesia, until the waves carried them to the shores of Africa and the Americas. Wherever they went, they built shrines to the rising sun and left behind stories of a land that had burned, then drowned. One legend told that a group settled among the plateaus of the Himalayas, building sanctuaries in caves that would one day become the monasteries of Tibet. There, the Nakal priests of Mu, said to be the last guardians of sacred science, inscribed their knowledge on tablets of stone and gold. Their writings spoke of vibration, balance, and the hidden unity of all life. The same truths they believed had sustained their lost empire. In later retellings, these teachings became the secret foundation of every great wisdom tradition, from the Vedas to Egyptian Hermeticism. Others fled eastward. They followed the shifting tides and island chains toward the rising Pacific, where new lands waited above the waters. In Polynesia, oral histories still tell of ancestral homelands swallowed by the sea, the islands of Hiva and Haiviki, the lands of Cain beyond the horizon. The people who came after remembered their forebears as sky voyagers, navigators who carried the sun's fire within them. When the missionaries of the 19th century recorded those tales, they recognized in them echoes of the same story Europeans told of Atlantis and Lemuria, that something once great had fallen and its children had scattered. Across the oceans, the stories multiplied. In India, Tamil poets spoke of a drowned kingdom called Kumari Kandam, a land of wisdom and abundance that once stretched south from the tip of the subcontinent. When the seas rose, the land vanished, leaving behind only the people and their language. The Dravidians, whose roots some mystics insisted reached back to Lemuria. The serpent temples of South India, the sun symbols of early Hindu art, all they said were faint reflections of the Lemurian past. In the Americas, another set of echoes stirred. Theosophical and occult writers of the early 20th century pointed to Peru and Bolivia, to the Cyclopean stones of Tiahuanaco, as proof of an elder race. How, they asked, could primitive men have built such vast monoliths at altitudes where air itself seemed thin with eternity? To them, these were not monuments of local genius, but relics of Lemurian migrants, survivors who had crossed the Pacific long before history began, bringing with them the arts of stone and star. And then there was the legend of Mount Shasta, rising solitary above the plains of Northern California. By the early 1900s, spiritualists claimed that within its snowbound core lay the last refuge of the Lemurians, a hidden city of light known as Telos. Its inhabitants, ageless and serene, were said to guard the wisdom of the ancient world, waiting for humanity to mature enough to receive it again. Travelers told of strange lights glimmering beneath the mountain, and of figures tall and radiant glimpsed among the trees at dusk. To some, they were myth. To others, memory refusing to die. Even Edgar Cayce, the American mystic who read the past as though it were a dream still unfolding, spoke of survivors who had fled both Lemuria and Atlantis. In his trance readings, they journeyed across Asia, settling in Egypt and the Andes, carrying with them knowledge of sound, crystal, and vibration. The technologies of spirit turned to science. They became the keepers of the world's sacred architecture. The pyramids, the megaliths, the temples aligned with the stars. Their work, he said, was to preserve what could be saved until the cycle of destruction would begin again. Modern archaeology, cautious and empirical, has never found such a diaspora, yet it does uncover something else, a faint pattern beneath the legend. Around the end of the last ice age, as the seas rose, coastal peoples across the globe were forced inland. Settlements vanished beneath the tides, leaving memories of lands lost to the sea. The echoes of that trauma endure in every flood myth from Mesopotamia to Polynesia. Perhaps the survivors of the deep were real after all, not as exiles of vanished continents, but as human beings watching their world dissolve. For the theosophists, though, the story carried a deeper resonance. The wanderers of Lemuria were not merely displaced, they were transformed. They had carried the seed of consciousness across the water, ensuring that spiritual evolution would continue. From their scattered remnants came the fourth root race, the Atlanteans, who would rebuild civilization in a new image. To lose Lemuria was to learn limitation, and in that loss lay the possibility of renewal. The survivors' journey was, in essence, humanity's first migration, both outward and inward. As they crossed the newborn seas and carved symbols into alien stone, they were translating memory into myth, turning catastrophe into meaning. The drowned continent became a metaphor that outlived its geography. Everywhere they landed, they left traces that would later harden into legend. In the petroglyphs of the Pacific Islands, spirals that seemed to echo the shape of galaxies. In the serpent carved into Indian temples, the coiling of creation and time. In the oral traditions of Polynesia and the Andes, tales of teachers who came from the sun and vanished beneath the waves. Their knowledge, the stories say, was not lost. It sleeps in stone, in song, in the geometry of sacred places. Some claim it lies encoded in the crystal skulls said to hold the memory of forgotten ages, or in the seed crystals buried within mountains to awaken when the earth is ready. Others find it in the persistence of the same dream across cultures, that once, before history, we were one. Whether taken as myth or metaphor, the image endures, a remnant sailing from the ashes of one world to the shore of another, carrying fragments of light through the dark. The flood may have washed away their cities, but not their story. It moves beneath our own like a current, unseen, unending, and impossibly old. And in the next age, in the dawn that followed the deluge, those fragments would gather again. From their meeting rose the next empire of memory, the great synthesis of two continents into one legend, the union of Lemuria and Mu, and the birth of humanity's most enduring myth of all. Long after the seas had swallowed their cities, the memory of Mu refused to rest. In the stories that drifted across generations, survivors had not simply vanished. They had carried with them the written voice of their world. Somewhere, hidden in stone and symbol, the records of the drowned continent still waited to be read. The claim began with James Churchward, but it did not end with him. He said he had studied the sacred Nakal tablets in a temple in India. Thousands of stone sheets engraved with a language older than Sanskrit, each one detailing the laws, the science, and the faith of the motherland. He insisted he had learned to read them under the tutelage of an Indian priest, who revealed only a fraction of their meaning. The tablets, he said, told of the creation of life, the rise of Mu and its destruction by fire and sea. No one else ever saw them. To Churchward's critics, that absence was proof enough of invention. To his followers, it made them holy. The unseen always holds more power than the visible. After his books spread through Europe and America, new voices began to claim they too had found fragments of Mu's legacy. The Pacific and the jungles of Central America became theaters for discovery. Stone inscriptions from Easter Island, the carvings of Polynesia, the glyphs of the Maya, all were reimagined as echoes of the same vanished tongue. The Narkal priests, the story went, had sailed across the ocean before the final collapse, hiding their archives in mountain monasteries and buried sanctuaries. Some placed those repositories in Tibet, where high plateaus might have survived the floods. Others pointed to the temples of Burma or the ruins of Yucatan, claiming to hear the same cadence in the names of gods and kings. Churchward himself believed the Narkals had founded the first civilization of Central America, teaching astronomy, agriculture, and architecture to the descendants of Mu's refugees. The theory was impossible to prove, but easy to believe. In those years, archaeology was young and the world still half-mapped. Strange glyphs emerged from the soil every season. Temples surfaced from jungle and sand. The desire to link them all, Egypt, Sumer, the Indus, the Maya, was irresistible. The notion of a single source civilization made the chaos of history seem ordered, almost merciful. Writers of the 1920s and 1930s filled in the gaps with devotion. They described the Narkal priest kings as men of luminous bearing, dressed in white and gold, who had preserved the knowledge of the creative force when their world died. Some said they could command elements with sound. Others that they had learned to store thought itself in crystal. Wherever civilization rose afterward, one could find their signature: the sun disk, the serpent, the cross within the circle. As the century advanced, these symbols multiplied like constellations. Scholars who studied the Maya found spirals and star patterns. Egyptologists uncovered solar emblems. Linguists traced coincidences between distant tongues. Coincidence became connection, and connection became proof. Churchward's invisible tablets had escaped his temple and spread across the world. There were other claimants too. In the American Midwest, amateur archaeologists announced the discovery of stone plates inscribed with strange letters. The Burroughs Cave tablets, allegedly bearing the script of Mu. Others claimed to find relics in Illinois, California, and beneath the deserts of Arizona. None withstood scrutiny, but each found its believers. The dream of the drowned continent had become an open secret. The world was full of its traces, if one knew how to read them. To the mystics who inherited Churchward's vision, the search for Mu's tablets was less about excavation than revelation. They believed the knowledge of the motherland was hidden not only in stone, but in memory, that humanity itself was the archive. The Narkal priests, said one writer, had not buried their wisdom, but implanted it within consciousness, so that every age would rediscover it in dreams and symbols. The myth began to turn inward. Even in its transformation, it kept a certain dignity. The story of the lost tablets was a myth of continuity, that nothing wise is ever truly lost, only misunderstood. For a disenchanted modern world, it was a promise that meaning survived catastrophe. By mid-century, the quest for the tablets had left the realm of exploration and entered that of spirituality. Esoteric groups in California, France, and Australia claimed to channel the teachings of the Narkals directly. Their messages spoke of unity, of the coming restoration of the old wisdom, of a humanity returning to the harmony once known on Mu. The priest kings had become voices of conscience for an industrial age. At the same time, professional archaeologists, men like Paul Rivet and Alfred Métraux, were mapping the Pacific's real migrations, tracing the spread of Polynesian peoples, languages, and genetic lines. Their findings told a different story, not of a vanished continent, but of extraordinary navigation adaptation, and resilience. Yet even they admitted the myths were persistent. Every island has its Hiva, Metro wrote. Every people remembers a homeland, now under the sea. The persistence of that memory, even without evidence, fascinated psychologists and poets alike. Could the flood myths of so many cultures, from Mesopotamia to Tahiti, be recollections of an actual global event, perhaps the post-Ice Age rising seas? Or were they something older still, a metaphor embedded in human consciousness? The fear of loss, the yearning for return. In the myth of the lost tablets, both interpretations coexist. On one level, they are artifacts, the hope that history can be recovered. On another, they are metaphors, the belief that truth, once known, can never be entirely erased. Whether carved in stone or written in the mind, the teachings of the Naikal priests stand for memory itself, the refusal to vanish. By the 1940s, the legend had begun to fuse with that of Lemuria. The Narkals were no longer the keepers of Mu alone, but of all ancient wisdom. They became the intermediaries between worlds, the survivors who had walked from one sunken age into another. The myth that began in a British officer's imagination had become a universal scripture, its symbols scattered across continents and centuries. And yet, as the stories multiplied, so did the silence. No tablets ever surfaced, no inscriptions matched their supposed language. The Pacific floor revealed no lost cities, only the slow geology of time. But perhaps that was the point. The world did not need discovery, it needed memory. In the end, the legend of the lost records says more about us than about Mu. It reveals a species that cannot bear the thought of absolute erasure. Somewhere, we insist, the truth survives. Hidden, waiting, inscribed in a language we will one day remember how to read. The priests of Mu may have perished, their temples long dissolved, but their echoes endure in every tale of wisdom retrieved from the abyss. And if no archaeologist will ever find their tablets, perhaps that is because the story was never meant to be unearthed, only retold. For beyond the drowned lands of the Pacific, new myths were already forming, of how the fragments of Lemuria and Mu would merge into a single memory, a united story of origins that stretched across two oceans and into the human heart. By the middle of the 20th century, the boundaries between Lemuria and Mu had begun to dissolve. What had once been two distinct worlds, one born of Victorian science, the other of colonial imagination, were now mirror images, reflecting the same hunger for a lost origin. In the hands of mystics, novelists, and spiritual societies, they became one continent, one story, one dream. It was an inevitable convergence. Lemuria had offered the age of fire, Mu, the age of light. Both told of beings close to perfection, of balance undone, of wisdom drowned and half-remembered. Each answered the same question. If humanity has fallen, from where did it fall? And so, as the decades turned, storytellers began to weave the two into a single myth. A prehistoric Eden that spanned the Indian and Pacific Oceans, the bridge between Asia and America, the mother of all civilizations. One of the first to fuse them was Frederick Spencer Oliver, a California writer whose 1894 work, A Dweller on Two Planets, would later become the seedbed for much of modern esotericism. Written, he claimed, under dictation from a disembodied voice, the book described an initiate from ancient Atlantis recalling past lives in both Lemuria and Mu. Oliver's vision was lush, filled with crystalline cities, floating ships, and technologies of light. But beneath the fantasy lay a theme that would endure, that all civilizations, no matter how advanced, repeat the same cycle of discovery, arrogance, and renewal. After Oliver came a generation of interpreters who carried the myth into new orders of faith. Among them was Wishar Spencer, founder of the Lemurian Fellowship in California, who taught that the Lemurians had survived beneath Mount Shasta and were guiding humankind towards spiritual maturity. His 1931 book, Lemuria, The Lost Continent of the Pacific, reimagined both Lemuria and Mu as one, a unified realm of golden temples and cosmic teachers who had once ruled the earth. He called it the birthplace of the soul of man. The Rosicrucian leader, Harvey Spencer Lewis, went further, publishing accounts of initiations said to revive the ancient Lemurian mysteries. His order blended Hermetic philosophy with modern mysticism, claiming that the adepts of Mu and Lemuria had preserved their wisdom through hidden brotherhoods that still met in the deserts of Egypt and the mountains of Tibet. Through such teachings, the myth left behind its geography and entered psychology. The lost continent became an inner landscape, the submerged memory of humankind's spiritual infancy. By the 1940s, Lemuria and Mu were rarely told apart. Maps drawn in the pages of occult journals showed a single supercontinent stretching from the Indian Ocean to the far Pacific, its mountain ranges matching the seafloor ridges discovered by oceanographers. Lemuria's volcanic heart merged with Mu's gentle plains. The ruins of one became the temples of the other. Together, they formed the motherland of mankind, the sacred world that had birthed both East and West. The myth spread through popular culture as much as through esoteric study. The rise of pulp magazines and early science fiction provided new stages for old ideas. Stories of underground cities, surviving colonies, and luminous masters multiplied. Writers like H.P. Lovecraft borrowed fragments of the legend for darker visions. His lost Pacific realms filled not with sages, but with sleeping gods. Yet even these horrors carried the same fascination, the sense that beneath our world lay another, older one, vibrating faintly through the deep. Outside fiction, the legend found new adherents among spiritual seekers. The mountaintops and deserts of America became sacred ground for believers in hidden masters. The so-called Brotherhood of the Seven Rays, the I Am movement, and countless small circles that mixed theosophy, Christianity, and cosmic revelation. They spoke of the elder race of Lemuria, guiding the destiny of humanity from the inner earth, preparing the world for its return to harmony. Mount Shasta, already central to earlier Lemurian lore, became the chosen portal, a meeting point between the seen and unseen worlds. The merger of Lemuria and Mu also reflected the shifting understanding of Earth itself. The discovery of continental drift and plate tectonics in the mid-20th century redefined geology. The continents were not static. They moved, collided, and tore apart. To some, this vindicated the ancient myths. The Earth, after all, did swallow land and raise new mountains. The lost continents might not exist, but the idea of a changing, restless planet, a world that forgets its own shape, had become scientific truth. In this new light, the story of Lemuria and Mu gained metaphorical power. They became symbols of deep time, of civilizations erased by forces beyond control. The cataclysms that once sounded like divine punishment now echoed the language of geology and climate. The myths had modernized themselves, yet their spiritual undercurrent never vanished. Post-war seekers, turning from materialism toward mysticism, found in the merged myth a narrative of unity. Lemuria and Mu together spoke of a humanity once whole, a global family before the divisions of race and nation, before the fall into conflict. They were not merely continents, They were the memory of oneness. Writers began to connect the merged legend with Atlantis, positioning it as its forerunner. Lemuria Mu was the first experiment of creation, the childhood of the world. Atlantis was its adolescence, brilliant and reckless. The pattern was now complete. 3 lost continents, Lemuria, Atlantis, and finally the world we inhabit, each reflecting a stage of spiritual evolution. In this triad, the destruction of Lemuria and Mu was not a tragedy, but a transition, a shedding of innocence to make way for intellect. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire mythology of antiquity had been rewritten into a single narrative, from the Lemurian dawn to the Atlantean twilight, to our own uncertain day. It was history recast as parable, not a record of facts, but of lessons. The modern mind, for all its skepticism, could not quite abandon the image. Oceanographers might chart the Pacific floor in meticulous detail, but the imagination continued to see temples and roads beneath the waves. Each new discovery of an underwater ridge or plateau, from the Mascarene Basin to the Zealandia Plateau, briefly rekindled the question: could these be fragments of the old motherland? Science said no, but myth only needed perhaps. In that perhaps lay the endurance of the story. The merging of Lemuria and Mu created more than a myth of geology. It created a mythology of continuity. It told us that nothing truly disappears, that what sinks in one form resurfaces in another. Whether through reincarnation, rediscovery, or imagination, the lost world always returns. By the 1960s, their union had become canon within the esoteric West. Lemuria and Mu were 2 syllables of the same word, the first song of Earth remembered in fragments. Even now, the legend adapts, appearing in the language of the New Age, in novels, in digital myths whispered online. Each retelling alters the geography, but keeps the pulse intact. The dream of a civilization so pure it could not survive its own awakening. And thus the twin continents, once separated by ocean and origin, became one story, an eternal reflection between 2 mirrors. Lemuria gave the myth its soul. Mu gave it its heart. Together, they formed the oldest truth the human mind seems able to imagine, that somewhere before the world became broken, we lived in harmony, and that the sea, in swallowing that world, did not erase it, but preserved it, waiting for us to remember. Every myth, like every world, gives birth to another. In the cosmology that united Lemuria and Mu, their submergence was not an ending, but a transformation, a descent that cleared the stage for the next great civilization. Atlantis, the heir to both worlds, the 4th root race in the theosophical account of creation. If Lemuria represented humanity's awakening, the moment spirit first entered flesh, then Atlantis was the moment that flesh became conscious of power. Where Lemuria had lived by instinct and harmony, Atlantis would live by intellect and will. The fires that had destroyed the first world did not extinguish knowledge, they refined it. From the surviving fragments of Lemuria's priesthood, a new people emerged, tempered by catastrophe and inheritance. Theosophical texts placed the rise of Atlantis roughly 1 million years after the first Lemurian dawn, though time in these accounts is a language of symbols, not numbers. The world had cooled, the seas had settled, and where the Atlantic now lies, a vast continent stretched between the Americas and Africa. To the east, Lemuria's peaks remained as scattered islands. To the west, the highlands of Mu dotted the Pacific. Humanity had spread across both oceans, the children of fire now shaping the world with thought. Atlantis inherited the Lemurian legacy of knowledge, geometry, astronomy, and the subtle sciences of vibration. They were said to have mastered vril, the vital energy of the universe, using it to power machines of flight and healing. The great crystals of Lemuria became, in Atlantean legend, the engines of progress, radiant towers that drew energy from the Earth's core and the stars above. Through them, the Atlanteans built their cities, illuminated their skies, and sustained their lives far beyond natural span. But power rarely walks without shadow. The same duality that had divided Lemuria began again. The faithful and the ambitious, the keepers and the usurpers. Theosophy divided Atlantis into successive ages and subraces, from the early Romoahal, born of Lemurian stock, to the Turanian, the Toltec, and finally the Aryan, precursors to modern man. Each era advanced in intellect and mastery, and with each advancement came new temptation. In the golden age of Atlantis, knowledge and spirituality existed in balance. Its people studied the stars, measured the heartbeat of the earth, and lived by the harmony between will and wisdom. Temples of pure light crowned their cities. Music was their mathematics. Their government, a council of wise men and women, chosen for virtue rather than birth. They were said to possess flying vessels that glided above the sea, and lenses that could magnify distant worlds. But as centuries passed, ambition overtook wisdom. The Turanian race, restless and proud, turned knowledge to conquest. They discovered that the same forces that could heal could also destroy. Crystals tuned to harmony could be tuned to dissonance, releasing energies that split the land. The legend calls it the War of the Sons of Belial, the Atlantean priests who sought dominion, against the sons of the Law of One who served the ancient harmony. For a time, balance held, but pride is a quiet contagion. The Atlanteans began to think themselves equal to the gods, or perhaps their rivals. Their experiments, said later mystics, disrupted the equilibrium of the planet itself. The Earth responded as it had before, with fire, flood, and a long unraveling. The first great catastrophe struck without warning. Volcanoes erupted across the mid-Atlantic. Tremors tore through the crystal towers. A portion of the continent sank beneath the sea, leaving only a crescent of islands. Survivors fled eastward to Egypt and westward to the Americas, carrying what they could of their knowledge. The remainder rebuilt, proud and unrepentant, vowing that Atlantis would never fall again. Yet the cycle could not be broken. The second destruction came generations later, followed by a third, the final submergence remembered by Plato in his Timaeus and Critias, when, in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared beneath the waves. To the ancients, it was a moral fable. To the theosophists, it was memory, the last act of a drama that had begun with Lemuria's awakening. Plato's account would become the thread that stitched the myth of Atlantis to that of Lemuria and Mu. The philosopher wrote of an island empire born from the gods, rich in virtue, undone by excess. He never mentioned the earlier worlds, yet his story fit perfectly into their framework. The theosophists simply placed him at the end of a much longer cycle, the chronicler of the final sinking, not the beginning. To them, the line was unbroken. Lemuria, the age of instinct; Atlantis, the age of intellect; and the modern world, the age of self-awareness, struggling to remember both. Each catastrophe was not punishment, but progression. The earth and humanity shedding forms no longer fit for spirit's evolution. In later esoteric writing, Lemuria and Atlantis became the twin poles of human potential. Intuition and reason, heart and mind, feminine and masculine, creation and structure. Their union, achieved through countless lifetimes, was the path back to balance. The myths ceased to be prehistory and became prophecy. The promise that when these dualities reconciled, the world would enter its next phase. The era of synthesis, the return of unity. Outside the temples and lecture halls, the idea found new expression in art and science fiction. Writers like Ignatius Donnelly, who had once treated Atlantis as historical speculation, now saw it reflected in geology and myth alike. The newly discovered mid-Atlantic ridge seemed proof that continents did indeed rise and fall. For every debunker, a believer arose, tracing the pattern of loss and rebirth across time. By the 1930s and 1940s, the myth of the lost world had become part of modern culture. The rise of atomic power gave it fresh urgency. The image of a civilization destroyed by its own mastery of energy no longer belonged to fable. It was a warning. Atlantis became the mirror of a modern humanity, learning again how to split the atom and command the forces of the earth. The myth, born in prehistory, had come full circle. To the faithful, however, the end of Atlantis was not despair. It was continuity. The survivors, like those of Lemuria and Mu before them, fled to the mountains and deserts of the world. They became the architects of the first post-Diluvian cultures. Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, carrying the fragments of a knowledge too powerful to perish. The pyramids, the ziggurats, the sacred calendars, all, in this telling, are the fingerprints of Atlantis, and through it, of Lemuria. In the esoteric imagination, then, the three continents form a single inheritance. Lemuria, the soul's birth; Atlantis, its adolescence; and our own world, its reckoning. The Atlantean twilight did not extinguish the light of the first worlds. It diffused it, scattering its embers across history. In every civilization that rose afterward, there would be a whisper of the same story. That once humanity knew harmony, and that the memory of that harmony is what drives us forward still. The sea keeps its secrets, but the mind never stops diving. The myths of the drowned worlds survive, because they remind us that knowledge and loss are inseparable, that creation is always shadowed by forgetting. And somewhere in that pattern, beneath the ruins of Atlantis, beneath the silence of Lemuria, beneath the unending tides, lies the oldest truth of all, that what we destroy, we are destined to remember. By the dawn of the 20th century, the sea was no longer a mystery, or so people believed. The new century brought sonar, deep-sea cables, submarines, and the first scientific expeditions to chart the unseen floor of the oceans. Yet the more the modern world measured, the more it seemed to search for what could not be measured. The myth of the drowned continents, Lemuria, Mu, and Atlantis, returned not in defiance of science, but as its haunting shadow. It began in libraries, in the margins of serious books. Theosophical texts still circulated among the curious. The secret doctrine, the lost Lemuria, the children of Mu. They were read less as revelations now and more as coded allegories, philosophies dressed in myth. Yet even as scholars dismissed them, readers felt their pull. Each promised a world that had once been whole, a memory of unity in an age obsessed with progress and fracture. In the first half of the century, the occult and the scientific often met in unexpected places. The Rosicrucian orders of California lectured on Lemurian wisdom under the same sky where observatories studied the stars. In Los Angeles, the I Am movement claimed contact with the ascended masters, beings from both Atlantis and Lemuria, who had survived the floods and now guided human evolution from higher planes. Mount Shasta, that snowbound volcano of the American West, became the new holy mountain, the supposed entrance to hidden cities where the remnants of the first races still watched over humankind. Meanwhile, the world was actually discovering its own forgotten lands. Archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Troy, proving that one myth at least had been rooted in truth. They mapped the sunken columns of Crete's Knossos, unearthing a Bronze Age civilization whose labyrinthine palaces seemed a ghost of Atlantis itself. Every spade of earth, every diver's descent, seemed to whisper that myths were not lies but half-memories. Writers seized on the idea. The 1920s and 1930s brought a wave of lost world fiction. Conan Doyle's The Lost World, Burroughs's At the Earth's Core, and countless tales of forgotten races dwelling beneath the ice or sea. In them, Lemuria and Mu reappeared as settings for adventure, science fiction, and prophecy. The world had been charted, but imagination refused to surrender its frontiers. During this same period, theosophists and independent thinkers continued to expand the old cosmology. Max Heindel, founder of the Rosicrucian Fellowship, described Lemuria and Atlantis as evolutionary stages in his 1909 Rosicrucian cosmo-conception. To him, they were neither allegory nor geology, but steps in the growth of consciousness, from physical to psychic to divine. His language was mystical but methodical, a spiritual Darwinism that fit neatly beside modern science. Others sought to ground the myths in evidence. Lewis Spence, a Scottish folklorist and journalist, spent decades comparing flood legends across the globe, convinced that a real catastrophe had inspired them all. He tried to reconcile Churchward's Pacific Mu with Plato's Atlantic Atlantis, arguing that both were cultural memories of the same primal disaster. His tone was that of a detective, yet his conclusion remained mythic. The sea has claimed its debt again and again, but the sea remembers. The fascination deepened in the post-war years. Ray Palmer, editor of Amazing Stories, popularized the so-called shaver mystery, letters from a man who claimed to have discovered an ancient subterranean civilization beneath the earth, descendants of the Lemurians who had fled underground before their world's destruction. The story blurred the line between pulp fiction and belief. Readers responded by the thousands. Some swore they too had encountered tunnels, cities, even survivors. The old continents had found a new medium, the magazine rack. The atomic age gave the legend new urgency. For the first time, humankind possessed the power to destroy its own civilization in fire. Atlantis and Lemuria no longer seemed ancient fables, but mirrors of the present. Writers began to draw explicit parallels. Just as the Atlanteans had misused the energies of the earth, modern nations were misusing the atom. Catastrophe was no longer mythic, it was imminent. Even as the myths gained apocalyptic overtones, genuine science was rewriting the planet's history in ways that made their imagery strangely familiar. The mid-century theory of continental drift, later refined into plate tectonics, revealed that continents did move, merge, and break apart over deep time. Mountains rose and oceans opened. Entire land masses had vanished before humanity ever existed. The earth was indeed alive, unstable, capable of swallowing itself. Lemuria and Mu were still fictions, but the world they implied, dynamic, impermanent, had become scientific fact. Meanwhile, explorers and adventurers searched for proof in every ocean. Expeditions dove along the ridges of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, photographing seamounts and reefs, announcing possible ruins that never quite survived investigation. Off the coast of Japan, divers reported terraces that looked like steps descending into the sea. In the South Pacific, volcanic atolls revealed shapes suggestive of old foundations. None proved anything. Each added another layer to the dream. In America, the psychic Edgar Cayce offered his own interpretation. In hundreds of trance readings during the 1930s and 40s, he spoke of reincarnations from Atlantis and Lemuria, of souls repeating the lessons of power and compassion. His voice was gentle, moral, less cosmic spectacle than human allegory. The drowned worlds, he said, were not warnings of geography, but of conscience. Each man is Atlantis, he told one listener. Each soul must choose whether it will remember its light. By the 1950s, Lemuria and Mu had entered the bloodstream of popular mysticism. Occult publishers reprinted Blavatsky, Churchward, and Donnelly side by side, their contradictions forgotten in the glow of shared wonder. Theosophical lodges still debated the root races. New Thought teachers reinterpreted them as metaphors for inner awakening. Even psychologists borrowed the imagery. Carl Jung referred to the flood as an archetype, a collective dream of renewal after destruction. To the modern psyche, the sunken continents were not lost places, but symbols of the unconscious itself, the vast and shifting deep beneath the rational mind. Yet, for all its transformations, the core of the legend endured, that human civilization is older, deeper, and more cyclical than we remember. Whether imagined as continents, epochs, or states of being, Lemuria and Mu persisted as reminders that knowledge and loss walk together. Each age discovers the world anew and forgets what the last one learned. The rediscovery of the lost continents then was not archaeological, but emotional. The modern world, certain of its machines and maps, still longed for mystery. The sunken lands returned to satisfy that longing, symbols of a truth that no technology could replace, that beneath progress lies a nostalgia for innocence, for a time when creation and meaning were one. By the century's end, sonar had scanned every ocean trench, but the myth endured. It moved from pulp pages to documentaries, from seance halls to the first digital networks, where new generations repeated the same questions. What if the world once held civilizations older than history, and what if their memory still guides us? Science answered with silence. The sea remained silent too, vast, indifferent, and utterly alive. Yet in that silence, imagination continued to speak. The rediscovery of Lemuria and Mu was never about finding ruins. It was about finding ourselves in the ruins we already fear to make. Long before Western mystics named Lemuria or Mu, the peoples of the Pacific and Indian Oceans were already telling their own stories, of lands that vanished beneath the waves. To them, these were not theories, but memory, woven into chants, genealogies, and songs that carried the weight of generations. The ocean, for these island cultures, was not a boundary, but a living archive. It spoke through tide and current, through the pattern of the stars, and what it remembered, above all, was loss. In the islands of Polynesia, oral traditions speak of Hiva, the homeland of the ancestors, a land that sank when the sea rose, forcing their people to scatter across the Pacific. The first settlers of Rapa Nui, the island Europeans would later call Easter Island, said they came from Hiva, guided by their king, Hotu Matua. When they arrived, they raised the great stone moai, facing inland toward the land that was gone, as if keeping watch for its return. Even today, elders on the island speak of a submerged world beyond the horizon, where the spirits of the first navigators still dwell. Far to the north, in Hawaii, instead the stories change shape, but not meaning. The earliest chants recall a sunlit land called Mu, or sometimes Kanahunamoku, the hidden realm of the god Cain, where the first people lived in harmony before being driven away by a great flood. The smaller beings of local legend, the Menehune, were said to be the builders who survived that cataclysm, retreating into forests and valleys when the waters came. Long before James Churchward claimed the name for his Pacific empire, the Hawaiians already used Mu to mean a place both real and sacred, a homeland remembered by the sea. In the southern reaches of the Indian Ocean, Tamil literature carries a different but hauntingly similar memory. The ancient poems of the Sangam era, Silapatikaram and Manimekalai, speak of Kumari Kandam, a vast kingdom that once stretched south from India's tip to the edge of the world. When the seas rose, they said, the land was divided and drowned, its poets and sages scattered to the north. Tamil scholars once treated this as mythology, but many later nationalists reimagined it as history, the cradle of Dravidian civilization, the Indian echo of Lemuria itself. Further east, in the waters of Indonesia and Malaysia, legends of lost lands are as common as coral reefs. The Javanese tell of Sunda, an island realm swallowed by the sea after a long age of prosperity. In Borneo, elders remember Nusantara, the islands between, an ancestral world torn apart by rising tides. These memories align uncannily with what modern geology now calls the Sunda Shelf, a real landmass that once joined the islands of Southeast Asia to the mainland before the end of the last ice age. Science gives it dates, myth gives it voice. And across the Pacific, in the highlands of Pompeii, the ruins of Nanmadol rise from a lagoon. Hundreds of basalt blocks stacked into a city of canals and walls, abandoned long before Europeans arrived. Its name means spaces between, and its builders are unknown. Some archaeologists call it the Venice of the Pacific. Others whisper that it was once a colony of Mu. Whatever its origin, the ruins stand like punctuation marks in a story the ocean has only half erased. In the far west, on the coast of Japan, divers have found the stepped stones of Yonaguni, terraces descending into the deep like a staircase for giants. Scientists argue they are natural formations, shaped by currents and earthquakes. But to the imagination, and to the islanders who speak of a land called Ryugu, the dragon's palace beneath the sea, they are something else, the boundary between memory and myth. To the Hopi and other Native American peoples, far from the ocean but steeped in its echoes, the same story appears in another form. They speak of previous worlds destroyed by fire and flood, of ancestors who took refuge underground until the earth was made new. When these people emerged, they carried tablets of wisdom, symbols of the old world's covenant with the Creator. It is the same pattern: destruction, survival, remembrance. Modern anthropology once dismissed such tales as coincidences, the natural product of humanity's fear of water. But after the discovery of submerged coastal plains worldwide, Doggerland in the North Sea, Zealandia beneath New Zealand, and the sunken river valleys of the Indian Ocean, scholars began to see them differently. Perhaps these myths were not fictions, but memories of real landscapes lost to the rising seas after the last ice age. The parallels are striking. Nearly every culture remembers a flood that ended an age. In Sumer, it was Utnapishtim. In Genesis, Noah. In the Pacific, the navigators of Hiva. Some speak of divine punishment, others of natural cycles. But all agree that civilization began again from a handful of survivors. In that sense, the myths of the Pacific and Indian Oceans are not distant from those of Lemuria and Mu. They are their ancestral roots, carried in the breath of sailors and storytellers long before the words continent or Atlantis existed. The myth of the sunken world survives because it mirrors the ocean itself, always shifting, always returning. For the island peoples, the sea is not a grave, but a womb. When an island erodes or vanishes, its name moves to another. The lineage continues. In this way, the Pacific does not mourn its lost lands, it reincarnates them. In the modern era, these indigenous memories have often been appropriated or reinterpreted through the lens of Western mysticism. Lemuria and Mu absorbed them, transforming local memory into universal myth. Yet beneath those overlays, the original voices remain clear. They are not tales of empire or enlightenment, but of kinship, between land and sea, past and present, the living and the gone. A Polynesian navigator once said, "The ocean is our library." He meant that every island is a page, every wave a line connecting stories too vast to write. In that sense, the legends of Hiva, Kumarikandam, and Mu are not fragments of a lost history. They are the history of loss itself, preserved through song and voyage. Perhaps this is why the myth endures, even when disproven. The scientific map may leave no space for a drowned continent, but the human map is drawn differently. It charts emotion, memory, belonging. The people of the Pacific never needed a word like Lemuria. They already knew that the world once was whole, and that wholeness, once lost, lives on in the act of remembering. And so, the voices of the Pacific still speak, in the chants of the navigators, in the stories of mountains that once were islands, in the silence of the reefs. Each tells the same truth in a different tongue, that the sea does not bury, it preserves. The myth has now come full circle. What began as a scientific hypothesis in Victorian England has dissolved back into the living stories from which it was unknowingly born. The lost continents were never found because they never left. They survive in the minds of those who still look to the horizon and call it home. When an age ends, it rarely vanishes. It sinks slowly, quietly, beneath the surface of the next. The story of Lemuria and Mu did the same. Long after their maps were folded away and their theories disproved, the two lost continents continued to drift through human thought like continents of imagination. The scholars moved on, but the idea remained that the Earth had known older worlds, wiser perhaps than our own, and that memory itself was an ocean, vast and uncharted. In the early 20th century, the myths of Lemuria and Mu began to fade from academic debate, but not from art or wonder. They reappeared in novels, paintings, and philosophical essays, not as geological speculation, but as metaphor, the symbol of an innocence buried by time. Writers found in them the perfect language for nostalgia, a continent that once held everything pure, now drowned beyond reach. For poets of the modern world, that loss felt familiar. The ocean, after all, had always been the oldest storyteller. Long before anyone spoke of tectonics or seafloors, the sea had already been cast as the keeper of memory, swallowing and preserving the past in equal measure. To stand on a shore, watching the horizon dissolve into haze, was to feel the presence of things unseen. The myth of Lemuria survived because it transformed that feeling into narrative. In the decades after the wars, when humanity's faith in progress faltered, these stories returned as mirrors. They told of civilizations undone not by ignorance, but by knowledge. Worlds too confident in their mastery of nature, punished by their own brilliance. The resemblance was uncomfortable. The mushroom cloud and the tidal wave belonged to the same vocabulary of destruction. The rediscovery of the myth was subtle. Historians studied flood legends and found them everywhere. Mesopotamia, Polynesia, India, the Americas. Archaeologists mapped coastlines that had once been dry land. Divers found walls and terraces beneath the waters of Japan and the Caribbean. None proved the existence of lost continents, but each confirmed a truth older than any map, that the Earth forgets and remembers in cycles, and that all civilizations live on borrowed time. By the second half of the century, Lemuria and Mu had entered what might be called their reflective phase. They no longer needed believers. They had become cultural memory. Painters evoked them in color and light, cities of coral and gold beneath green waves. Philosophers used them to describe the hidden layers of the mind, the submerged continent of the unconscious. Even scientists, while rejecting their literal reality, sometimes borrowed their language to explain the Earth's slow transformations. The myth and the planet had reconciled. Both were restless, both eternal. The space age expanded that perspective further. As cameras sent back images of the Earth from orbit, a blue sphere without borders, the idea of a lost, unified world took on new poignancy. Lemuria and Mu were no longer about geography at all. They were about unity. They spoke to the ancient human wish that the divisions of continents, nations, and faiths were accidents of erosion, not destiny. And yet, the myth remained restless. It resurfaced wherever people sought meaning beyond the visible. Spiritual teachers spoke of remembering Lemuria, not as history, but as heritage, an inward awakening to an older harmony between humankind and nature. Environmental movements borrowed its imagery, invoking the fall of the first worlds as a warning that the planet, once wounded, will always heal itself, with or without us. Even the rise of the internet, the newest ocean of all, gave the legend fresh breath. For a time, it flickered in digital forums and documentaries, not as proof, but as curiosity. Could there still be something vast and beautiful hidden beneath the world we know? The question mattered more than the answer. Each generation that rediscovers Lemuria proves the same truth, that myth is not a relic, but a mirror polished anew. Modern science, in its way, vindicated the heart of the story. It revealed a planet in constant motion, continents drifting, seas rising, mountains crumbling, islands born and drowned again. The Earth had indeed erased its own chapters many times over. Beneath the Indian and Pacific Oceans, researchers traced the outlines of sunken plateaus. Zealandia, Kerguelen, Sunderland, the real ghosts of geology. None were Lemuria or Mu, yet they whispered of a world where land and sea had always traded places, where permanence was an illusion. That illusion, the belief that what is seen will last, may be what Lemuria truly challenges. Its legend asks us to remember that everything we build, no matter how vast, stands at the mercy of tides and time. The ocean is patient, it has eternity on its side. But the myth is not only a warning. Beneath its melancholy lies hope, the conviction that what vanishes is never wholly lost. Theosophists once said the Lemurians survived through their descendants, that knowledge can outlive its origin. Modern thinkers say much the same, that culture, memory, and imagination are the true survivors of any cataclysm. In that sense, every poem, every theory, every retelling of the lost continents is an act of resurrection. Perhaps that is why Lemuria and Mu continue to surface, century after century, even in an age that claims to have outgrown myth. They remind us that forgetting is never complete. Every coastline hides a ruin. Every ruin hides a story. Every story hides a truth about ourselves. The ocean within and the ocean without are made of the same water. Today, satellites trace the deep trenches of the Pacific, and sonar paints the floor of the Indian Ocean in shades of blue. We know what lies beneath: mountains, ridges, plains, but not why they still stir us. Somewhere between the data and the dream, the mind insists that the world has secrets left to tell. And so the story of the lost continents endures, not because it defies science, but because it completes it. It gives emotion to knowledge, myth to measurement. It teaches that discovery is never only about finding, but about remembering, and that perhaps memory itself is the oldest form of exploration. The age of Lemuria has passed, if it ever was, but the age of memory has only begun. In every tide, in every satellite image of the Earth's slow rotation, something ancient looks back. It does not demand belief. It only invites wonder. Because the sea still moves, as it did 1,000,000 years ago. Because the land still trembles. Because the human heart still turns toward the horizon, listening for what the waves are trying to say. The story of the lost continents ends where it began, with the sea. It has been there from the first whisper of Lemuria to the last search for Mu, patient and unchanging, keeper of both truth and illusion. Every generation has looked into it and seen what it most needed to find: evidence, redemption, or wonder. And though science has traced every current and measured every depth, the ocean remains the perfect symbol of what we cannot fully know. When the first theories of Lemuria appeared, they belonged to an age of optimism, a century convinced that every mystery could be solved by reason. Today, we know more than those early thinkers could have imagined, yet the sense of mystery has only deepened. We can map the floor of the Indian Ocean, trace the ridges of the Pacific, follow the scars of continental drift, and still the sea keeps its secrets. For the believers of the 19th century, Lemuria was the missing chapter of Earth's history. For the mystics of the 20th, it was the lost page of humanity's soul. Modern science gives us something simpler, but no less astonishing: a planet that erases and rewrites itself. Continents shift, oceans rise, entire landscapes disappear. The Earth has swallowed countless worlds, real and imagined, and it will swallow ours in time. In recent decades, exploration has revealed traces of those forgotten worlds. Not the mythical Lemuria or Mu, but real fragments of the Earth's earlier design. Beneath the Indian Ocean, geologists discovered Mauritius, a sunken microcontinent buried beneath volcanic rock. It is not a city of giants or a kingdom of light, but a drowned piece of Gondwana, a world older than memory. In the shallows of Japan, divers found the Yonaguni terraces, vast steps descending into blue shadow. Whether natural or carved, they remind us how easily stone can mimic intention. Off the coast of India, sonar revealed the walls and streets of Dwarka, once a myth from Hindu scripture, now a city proven real, and older than any civilization we thought possible. None of these discoveries prove Lemuria or Mu, but together they show that myth was never completely wrong. The Earth does change shape. It does bury its histories. It does leave ghosts behind. Perhaps the ancient imagination was not mistaken so much as premature. The flood legends of every culture tell the same story in different tongues. The world drowns, the survivors begin again, and memory becomes myth. What separates Lemuria from those older tales is not what it says, but what it reveals: that the human mind cannot bear the idea of absolute erasure. If something beautiful once existed, then somewhere it must still exist, even if only in us. For centuries, people searched for physical proof: lost inscriptions, submerged pyramids, vanished islands. But the endurance of Lemuria and Mu comes not from discovery, but from the refusal to forget. We continue to retell the story because it answers a need that evidence cannot. It promises that knowledge and imagination belong to the same lineage. Science has replaced the land bridges and catastrophes with its own epic: plate tectonics, volcanic cycles, and ice ages. Yet the moral of the story remains unchanged. Civilizations rise, flourish, and fall. The sea erases their borders and leaves behind silence. Every ruin we uncover, every fossil we lift from the rock, is proof not of how much we know, but of how much time can take away. In that sense, Lemuria and Mu are not falsehoods, they are warnings. They remind us that mastery over nature has always been temporary. The people who imagined those continents did not foresee the climate models or melting glaciers of our own time, but they understood the rhythm that the world renews itself through loss. The flood, literal or metaphorical, is never the end of history. It is how history begins again. Even now, the myth continues to evolve. Historians trace its origins through Victorian science and theosophical mysticism. Artists borrow its imagery to paint dreamlike ruins beneath the waves. Environmental writers use it to symbolize the vanishing balance between humankind and the planet. And in quiet moments, at shorelines, in museums, in front of maps that no longer have blank spaces, people still ask the same question that haunted Sclater and Blavatsky alike. What if we have forgotten something essential? It is that question, more than any lost continent, that endures. The idea of Lemuria remains powerful, not because it explains the past, but because it challenges the present. It asks us to imagine what might vanish next. The Earth is not done remaking itself. Ice retreats, seas advance, islands tremble. In 1,000 years, the shape of our world will change again, and perhaps future generations will invent new myths to fill the silence we leave behind. There will always be another story, another city imagined beneath the tide, another paradise mourned by descendants who never saw it. That is how memory survives catastrophe. It turns loss into continuity. When archaeologists study the myths of flood and fire, they find patterns that feel universal. The sense of guilt that follows abundance, the faith that renewal lies beyond destruction. Lemuria and Mu fit easily into that pattern. They are not explanations of the past, but expressions of an old truth, that knowledge without humility destroys itself, and that every civilization carries the seeds of its own forgetting. The ocean does not mock these stories. It holds them. It has carried them from shore to shore, reshaping them as surely as it reshapes the land. To the ocean, there is no difference between myth and geology. Both are forms of movement. Modern technology has mapped nearly all of Earth's surface, yet it has not lessened the mystery beneath it. The internet age, for all its clarity, has only amplified curiosity. People still gather to share theories, to compare maps, to trace the lost lines of coast and reef. Each new generation discovers the story again, rephrases it, redreams it. In that endless retelling, the continents never truly sink. If Lemuria and Mu were born from science and transformed by faith, they end in reflection. They have become mirrors for the human condition, our longing for permanence, our awe before the planet that sustains and erases us. Whether we see them as lost lands or enduring metaphors, they remind us that imagination is humanity's oldest continent, and it has never stopped shifting. So the story closes where it began, with the sea turning light to shadow and shadow to light. Beneath its calm, the earth continues its slow creation, swallowing and revealing, forgetting and remembering. Somewhere in that motion lies the essence of every myth, the belief that nothing is truly gone, only waiting to be rediscovered. The last dawn of Lemuria will never arrive, because the sun never truly set. It lingers in the ocean's gleam, in the drift of stories that refuse to sink, in the unending rhythm of curiosity that drives us to look again. The continent may have been a fiction, but the wonder it awakened is real, and it endures as long as someone still stands at the edge of the sea, staring into the horizon and asks what the water remembers.